The watch lay broken on the carpet, its glass cracked, its hands frozen in absolute certainty. Everyone in the village agreed on the time it had stopped. Everyone felt reassured by that small, precise detail. Tea had been poured. Bells had rung. Nothing appeared disturbed. And yet, something was wrong. A man who lived by habit would never let time fail him without reason. As Miss Marple quietly observed the peaceful room, she understood what others did not. The watch had not stopped to tell the time. It had stopped to tell a story. And the story was carefully designed to be believed. Chapter 1. The Watch That Stopped at Tea Time. The afternoon settled over St. Mary Mead with the quiet certainty of routine. It was the sort of day the village treasured without comment. A pale sun drifted behind thin clouds, softening the gardens and hedgerows, lending everything a gentle, almost apologetic light. Curtains were half drawn against the mild chill. Kettles hummed. Teacups waited patiently on saucers as they always did at 4 o'clock. Miss Jane Marple sat near the front window of her small cottage, needles moving with steady precision. Her knitting was not hurried. It never was. She believed that haste, like gossip, often caused more trouble than it solved. Outside, Mrs. Bantry passed with her dog, waving briefly before continuing down the lane. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing ever did at first. The telephone rang. Miss Marple paused, counting one last stitch before setting the knitting aside. She rose slowly and answered with calm politeness. Yes? The voice on the other end belonged to Inspector Slack, and though he tried to sound measured, there was an unmistakable edge beneath his words. Miss Marple, I'm afraid there's been an incident. There was always an incident. Eventually, villages like St. Mary Mead depended upon order, and order, Miss Marple knew, was often the first thing disturbed when human nature felt ignored. Who? She asked gently. Mr. Lionel Weatherby. The name rested heavily in the air between them. Lionel Weatherby was not merely a resident. He was an institution. A retired horologist who had repaired clocks and watches for half the county. A man whose sense of time was legendary. Punctual to the minute. Precise in speech. Impeccable in habit. He has been found dead in his sitting room. The inspector continued. No obvious signs of violence. We would appreciate your presence. Miss Marple replaced the receiver slowly. Her knitting lay forgotten. She did not rush. She put on her coat, chose her hat with care, and locked the door behind her. Experience had taught her that first impressions were often misleading, but first atmospheres never were. Weatherby's house stood near the edge of the village green, neat and symmetrical, its windows always clean. The door was already open when she arrived. Inspector Slack stood inside, removing his hat. Thank you for coming so quickly, he said. Miss Marple nodded and stepped into the sitting room. The body lay peacefully in an armchair near the fireplace. Mr. Weatherby looked as though he had merely closed his eyes in thought. His spectacles rested neatly on the side table. His hands lay folded in his lap. On the carpet, just beside the chair, lay a pocket watch. It had shattered. The crystal was cracked clean through, the casing bent at an unnatural angle. Miss Marple felt a faint tightening in her chest. Not from shock, but from recognition. Damage like that did not occur through carelessness. Inspector Slack noticed her gaze. Yes, that caught my eye as well, he said. Stopped at 4:25. Miss Marple leaned closer, careful not to disturb anything. The watch was old, well used but lovingly maintained. She could see the marks of repeated repair, the tiny engravings Weatherby had added himself. This was not an object he would have dropped. Who found him? She asked. Mrs. Harper. She brings his tea every afternoon at 4:30. When he didn't answer, she let herself in. And the time? She says the tea was still warm when she arrived. Miss Marple straightened. Tea did not remain warm without reason, nor did habits break without cause. Around the room stood several villagers. Mrs. Harper wrung her hands near the door. Colonel Fletcher stared at the mantelpiece. Dr. Haydock adjusted his glasses, thoughtful but reserved. Miss Marple took it all in quietly. The silence, the symmetry, the calm. Too calm. She approached the mantel clock. It read 4:42. "Inspector," she said softly, "has anyone touched the watch?" "No. We thought best not to." "Good," Miss Marple replied, "because I believe it may be the most truthful thing in the room." Inspector Slack frowned, but said nothing. Miss Marple returned her gaze to the broken watch. Timepieces, like people, did not fail without reason, and those that stopped often did so at the most inconvenient moments. She looked at Mr. Weatherby's peaceful face and felt certain of one thing. The watch had not stopped when the village believed it had, and whatever happened in this room had happened earlier, quieter, and far more deliberately than anyone wished to admit. The sitting room filled slowly with murmured recollections, each villager offering their account with careful precision. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She had learned long ago that people revealed far more when they believed they were being helpful. Mrs. Harper spoke first. "I came as usual, 4:30. I always do. I put the tray down and knocked, but there was no answer." "And the tea?" Miss Marple asked. "Still warm," Mrs. Harper repeated, as if clinging to the detail. "Just as it should have been." Colonel Fletcher cleared his throat. "I saw Weatherby earlier. About 4. He waved from the window." Dr. Haydock nodded. "Yes, he was alive then, certainly." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, though her eyes never left the watch. "Inspector," she said, "may I ask something rather mundane?" "Of course. When did Mr. Weatherby usually wind his watch?" Dr. Haydock blinked. "Every day. Exactly at 4. And did he ever miss it?" "Never," Colonel Fletcher said. "He used to say a watch neglected would sulk." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She stepped closer to the armchair and noticed something else. A faint indentation on the carpet, slightly away from the chair, as though someone had stood there for some time. "Inspector," she said, "do you see where the watch lies?" "Yes, and where it would naturally fall if dropped." Slack crouched, visualizing it. His expression changed. "It wouldn't," he admitted. Miss Marple nodded. "No, it was placed, or thrown with intention." A silence followed. The villagers shifted uncomfortably. "But why break it?" "Mrs. Harper asked, almost pleading. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Because time is persuasive. People trust it more than memory." Inspector Slack straightened. "You're suggesting the time of death is wrong." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied gently, "that everyone here is quite certain about the wrong moment." She moved toward the window. Outside, the village continued its quiet rhythm. A bicycle passed. A door closed. Life, oblivious. Mr. Weatherby lived by routine, she continued. When routine is interrupted, it is rarely accidental. Someone knew exactly when he would be alone. Someone knew the importance of that watch. Dr. Haydock frowned. "But there are no marks. No struggle." Miss Marple turned back to him. "Not all violence leaves bruises, Doctor. Some of it leaves order." Inspector Slack rubbed his chin. "Then when did it happen?" Miss Marple glanced again at the watch. "Before 4:25, she said. "Possibly before 4. Mrs. Harper gasped. "But I saw him yesterday evening. He was fine." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly. "And today he was not." She stepped back, allowing the room to breathe again. "The watch tells us when something ended," she said softly. "But more importantly, it tells us when someone wanted us to stop asking questions." Inspector Slack met her eyes. "And you think the village has obliged?" "For now," Miss Marple replied. She picked up her gloves and prepared to leave. "Inspector," she added, "do let me know who insists most strongly on the time of death." In my experience, certainty often hides discomfort. Outside, the afternoon light had dimmed slightly. The church bells began to ring, marking the hour with steady confidence. Miss Marple paused, listening. Bells could be trusted. Watches could be broken, and somewhere between the two lay the truth, waiting patiently to be noticed. Chapter 2. Everyone remembers the wrong hour. The next morning arrived, with a soft grey sky and a thin veil of mist hanging over the village green. St. Mary Mead looked as it always did at the beginning of a day, tidy and modest and faintly proud of itself. If you did not know better, you might have believed that nothing unusual had occurred. The hedges were clipped. The postman walked with his usual pace. A robin hopped along a garden wall as if he owned the place. But beneath the surface, the village had shifted. In the small shops and at the bakery counter, conversation moved like a quiet stream that knew exactly where it wanted to go. It did not need to shout. It did not need to rush. Every sentence carried a careful weight, as though the villagers were balancing teacups filled too near the brim. Miss Marple walked slowly, her gloved hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. She was going toward the high street. But she did not hurry. She never hurried. There was time, she felt, to let people speak in their natural rhythm. At the corner near the florist, she met Mrs. Price Ridley, who had the kind of expression that suggested she had been waiting all morning for someone to ask her something. "Jane," Mrs. Price Ridley said, leaning closer in a manner that pretended not to be eager. "Such a dreadful business. Poor Lionel. Such a quiet man. You would never expect anything so shocking in his house." Miss Marple nodded. "It is always the quiet houses that surprise people, is it not?" Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes brightened. "Inspector Slack says it must have been around 4:25. The watch, you know. Everyone is saying it. Everyone agrees." Miss Marple's gaze remained mild. "Do they?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Price Ridley said, with relief. "It makes it easier, does it not? If everyone agrees on the time." "Easier," Miss Marple repeated gently, as if tasting the word. "Sometimes ease comes at the expense of accuracy." Mrs. Price Ridley frowned as though accuracy was an unnecessary hardship, but the watch was stopped. "That must mean something." "It does," Miss Marple said. "It means someone wants you to believe it." Mrs. Price Ridley drew back slightly. "Jane, you do not truly think the watch could be wrong?" Miss Marple smiled. "I think, my dear, that people can be remarkably wrong when they are trying to be helpful." Mrs. Price Ridley left shortly after, visibly unsettled, and Miss Marple continued her walk. She stopped at the bakery, bought a small loaf she did not really need, and lingered near the counter long enough to hear two women discussing how the church bells had rung at 4:30, and how they both remembered it perfectly. Perfectly, Miss Marple noted, was a dangerous word. Later, at the vicarage, she was received with gentle warmth. The vicar, Mr. Clement, offered tea without asking, because tea was the only proper response to trouble in St. Mary Mead. His wife moved about quietly, laying out biscuits and glancing at Miss Marple with the polite curiosity of someone who knew that Miss Marple often saw more than she said. "I suppose everyone has been talking," Miss Marple said, accepting her cup. The vicar sighed. "Talking and speculating, which is often the same thing, only with different intentions." "And what is the general belief," Miss Marple asked, "about yesterday?" The vicar hesitated. "That Mr. Weatherby died at 4:25, as Inspector Slack believes." "And why do they believe that?" Miss Marple asked softly. "The watch," Mrs. Clement said gently. "It is such a concrete detail. People like something they can point to." Miss Marple held her cup with both hands, not drinking, simply feeling the warmth. "Yes, a stopped watch is very reassuring. It feels definite. It does not wobble the way memory does." The vicar looked at her. "You disagree?" I suspect, Miss Marple said, that the watch is not evidence of time, but evidence of intention. A pause followed. Somewhere in another room a clock ticked, steady and untroubled. Tell me, Miss Marple continued, did the bells ring yesterday at 4:30? The vicar nodded. Yes, they did. And were they on time? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Clement smiled faintly. They are always on time. Lionel used to check them. He would come in here once a month and stand with his little notebook, listening. If the bells were a minute off, he would tell my husband with great politeness, and my husband would apologize, even though it was not his fault. Miss Marple's eyes softened. So Mr. Weatherby trusted the bells? Yes, the vicar said. He trusted time very much. Then, someone used that, Miss Marple murmured. After tea, Miss Marple went to see Inspector Slack at the temporary incident room set up near the police station. He looked tired, as though he had not slept well, and his desk was covered in statements written in different hands. You have come to tell me you were right, he said, half joking, half wary. I have come to ask what people have told you, Miss Marple replied. Slack pushed a stack of papers toward her. They have told me the same thing, over and over. That they were at tea. That they heard the bells. That they were exactly where they should have been around 4:25. Miss Marple scanned a few lines. The language differed slightly, but the meaning repeated itself like a refrain. Tea. Bells. Warm afternoon light. A neighbor seen at a gate. A door closed. A tray carried. A small ordinary world continuing exactly as expected. Do you see, Miss Marple said, how similar these accounts are? Slack bristled. It is a village. People do the same things. Yes, Miss Marple said calmly. But what interests me is not that they did the same things. It is that they remember them in the same way. Slack folded his arms. You think they have agreed on their stories? I think, Miss Marple corrected, that they have agreed on what they believe is safe. Slack sighed and rubbed his forehead. We have no sign of forced entry. No theft. Nothing disturbed. It looks natural. Except for the watch. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And the watch, Inspector, is disturbed in a manner that suggests force. Not a gentle drop. Not a careless slip. Force. Slack stared at her. What do you want me to do? Arrest someone for being too certain about tea? No, Miss Marple said. I want you to notice who is most eager to keep the village certain. Slack frowned. You mentioned that yesterday. Miss Marple nodded. People who are innocent often doubt themselves. They worry that they may have forgotten something. They apologize for uncertainty. A guilty person, on the other hand, clings to certainty like a raft. Slack looked away, unwilling to concede, but not dismissing her either. Who would have reason to kill Lionel Weatherby? Miss Marple set the papers down gently. Someone who feared what he might notice. Slack stared. Notice. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Mr. Weatherby noticed things for a living. He could hear a clock running fast, the way another man might hear a dishonest laugh. If something in this village was out of rhythm, he would feel it. Slack's expression changed slightly. He did not like the idea, but he could not deny it. Who visited him regularly? Miss Marple asked. Slack flipped through his notes. Mrs. Harper, the housekeeper. Colonel Fletcher, who plays cards with him once a week. Mr. Wainwright from the hardware shop, who sometimes brings supplies, and a young woman, Miss Dorothy Crane. She is a cousin of sorts, apparently. She called on him now and then. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with focus. And yesterday afternoon, Slack's jaw tightened. Dorothy Crane claims she was in the post office at 4:15. The postmistress confirms it. Colonel Fletcher was walking his dog near the green. Mrs. Harper says she was in the kitchen at Weatherby's, preparing the tea. Mr. Wainwright says he was in his shop with customers. Miss Marple leaned back. And all of them remember the bells. Slack nodded. as if the bells were a witness. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. But bells only tell time. They do not tell truth. Slack stared at her for a moment, then exhaled. All right. You have my attention. What do you think happened? Miss Marple's voice stayed gentle. I think the watch stopped at 4:25 because someone wanted it to. And I think the village has been guided to stand around that time like people standing around a marker at a graveside, unable to look beyond it. Slack frowned. Guided by whom? Miss Marple did not answer directly. She reached for her gloves. Inspector, she said. I would like to visit Weatherby's workshop. Slack blinked. His workshop, yes, Miss Marple said. A man who lives by time often keeps his secrets among his tools. Outside, the mist had lifted, but the village still felt muted, as though sound itself had become cautious. Miss Marple walked toward Weatherby's house again, and as she approached, she saw Mrs. Harper at the gate, speaking to another woman in low, urgent tones. Mrs. Harper noticed Miss Marple and stopped abruptly, her face flushed. Miss Marple, she said quickly, I was only telling Mrs. Abbott how dreadful it all is. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Yes, Mrs. Harper. Dreadful things do make people talk. Mrs. Harper swallowed. It must have happened at 4:25, must it not? The watch. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. Mrs. Harper, if you are repeating that to reassure yourself, it will not work for long. Mrs. Harper went pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if words had suddenly become risky. Miss Marple passed through the gate. Behind her, Mrs. Harper's breathing sounded shallow, like someone trying not to be heard. In the sitting room, the air still carried the faint trace of yesterday. A cold fireplace. The smell of tea that had been carried in, and then forgotten. The chair where Mr. Weatherby had died looked ordinary, and that ordinary appearance, Miss Marple knew, was what made the scene so unsettling. She walked through to the back of the house and into the workshop. It was small, tidy, and exact. Drawers were labeled in careful handwriting. Tiny tools rested in neat rows. Clocks stood in various stages of repair, their faces turned outward like calm, attentive eyes. On the workbench lay a second watch. Not broken. Not stopped. Open, with its delicate inner workings exposed. Miss Marple leaned closer. The hands of this watch pointed to 4:25, but the mechanism, she saw at once, was set deliberately. The hands had been moved. A chill settled quietly inside her. Not fear, but clarity. Someone had rehearsed 4:25. Someone had arranged for time itself to become a story. Miss Marple straightened, her face calm, her mind moving steadily. The village remembered the wrong hour, because someone had taught them to, and now she knew where to begin unteaching it. Miss Marple remained in the workshop for several minutes without touching anything. She did not need to touch. Her eyes did most of their work quietly, gathering details as a spider gathers tremors on its web. The second watch on the bench, open and carefully positioned, troubled her far more than the broken one in the sitting room, because it suggested preparation. A broken watch could be explained away by panic or struggle, even if the explanation was weak. An open watch with its hands set to a particular time suggested something else entirely. A person thinking ahead. A person constructing an idea. A person who understood how people listened to clocks. Inspector Slack entered behind her, his shoes tapping lightly on the wooden floor. He stopped when he saw her gaze fixed on the bench. You found something, he said. I found a question, Miss Marple replied. Slack came closer, squinting. That watch, it reads 4:25. Yes, Miss Marple said. And look. Slack leaned in. The hands have been shifted. I can see the minute hand is not aligned properly with the gear. Miss Marple nodded. A watchmaker would notice that at once. Mr. Weatherby would notice it at once. Which means it is very unlikely he set it like that himself, unless he was demonstrating something. Slack looked around the workshop, suddenly more alert. You think someone came in here? I think someone used this room, Miss Marple said. Perhaps while he was alive, perhaps after he was dead. But I do not yet know which. Slack's expression tightened. How would anyone get access? Miss Marple's eyes moved to a small hook beside the door. A ring of keys hung there, each one labeled. Workbench drawer, front door spare, back gate, cupboard. Slack followed her gaze. Those keys are too convenient. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Convenience is sometimes the most overlooked form of danger. Slack exhaled sharply. Mrs. Harper would have known about them. So would anyone who had been in the house often enough, Miss Marple said. Slack rubbed his jaw. What are you suggesting? That someone staged the time? I am suggesting, Miss Marple said, that the time has been made into a comfort. A simple line drawn in people's minds. If they can point to a watch and say 4:25, they feel they have done their duty. They have placed the trouble in a neat box. Slack looked grim. And if the trouble is not in that box, then it is still walking about. Miss Marple said gently. Slack stared at the open watch again. If Mr. Weatherby died earlier, it changes the window. It changes everything, yes, Miss Marple said. Slack stepped away, suddenly restless. All right, let us go through the village again. Let us test these statements. Miss Marple turned to him. Not by asking what people did, Inspector. Ask what they noticed. Slack frowned. That seems the same thing, it is not. Miss Marple said. People can invent actions easily. They can claim they poured tea or posted a letter. But noticing is more difficult. Noticing involves the senses, and senses are harder to rehearse. Slack paused, then nodded reluctantly. You have your methods. As they left the workshop, Miss Marple glanced once more at the labelled keys. A neat system, designed to make life orderly. Also designed, she thought, to make access easy for someone who knew what they were looking for. They walked first to the post office. Miss Dorothy Crane stood near the counter as if she belonged there, her posture composed, her hair perfectly arranged. She turned when she saw Inspector Slack, and her expression shifted smoothly into polite concern. Inspector, she said, is there any news? It is all so dreadful. Slack nodded stiffly. Miss Crane, you said yesterday you were here at 4:15. Yes, Dorothy replied. I posted a letter. I spoke to Mrs. Gibbons. I left shortly after. Miss Marple's voice was mild. What was the weather like when you posted it? Dorothy blinked, her composure wavering for the briefest moment. The weather, yes, Miss Marple said. Did you have an umbrella? Was there wind? Did you hear the birds? Dorothy's smile returned, but it looked slightly tighter. It was grey, I believe. It is always grey at this time of year, Miss Marple nodded. And when you stepped out of the post office, did you see anyone on the road? Dorothy hesitated. No one in particular. Slack watched her carefully now. You did not see Colonel Fletcher. He says he was walking his dog near the green. Dorothy's eyes flickered. I cannot be sure. That is perfectly reasonable, Miss Marple said gently. Uncertainty is honest. Dorothy's gaze snapped briefly toward Miss Marple, as though uncertain itself whether Miss Marple was being kind or sharp. Inspector Slack turned to Mrs. Gibbons, the postmistress, a woman who looked as though she had never trusted anyone fully. Was Miss Crane here at 4:15? He asked. She was, Mrs. Gibbons said firmly. She posted a letter. She asked about a parcel. She left. Miss Marple smiled. Mrs. Gibbons, do you remember what Miss Crane wore? Mrs. Gibbons frowned. A coat. A hat. Why should I remember? Miss Marple's tone remained soft. Because people remember what is unusual. Did anything about her seem unusual? Mrs. Gibbons sniffed. She was polite. That is unusual enough for some people. These days, Miss Marple thanked her and stepped aside with Slack. You are thinking that is solid, Slack muttered. I am thinking, Miss Marple replied, that it is solid only in the way people want it to be solid. Slack scowled. You mean she could have come earlier or later? Miss Marple said, that if a person is determined to anchor themselves to a time, they choose a place where others can confirm them. Slack's eyes narrowed. And a post office is perfect. Everyone sees everyone. Yes, Miss Marple said. So you must ask what no one is asking. Why does she need to be fixed to 4:15? They went next to the hardware shop. Mr. Wainwright was a thin man with careful eyes, the kind that tracked what people purchased and what they did not. Inspector, he said quickly, I have said all I know. I was in the shop. Customers came and went. I could not have left. Slack held up his hand. Yes. But tell me about yesterday afternoon. Did you hear anything? Mr. Wainwright frowned. Hear anything? A door slam. A shout. A vehicle, Slack said, not entirely sure he was doing it right. Mr. Wainwright shook his head. Nothing. It was all normal. Miss Marple's voice drifted in gently. Did anyone buy anything unusual? Mr. Wainwright stiffened. Unusual, yes, Miss Marple said. A tool. A heavy object. Something that might be carried with care. Mr. Wainwright's eyes narrowed. People buy all sorts. But did anyone buy something that made you remember them? Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. There was a young fellow, not from the village, bought a small hammer, the kind used for picture frames. He was in a hurry. Slack leaned forward. A young fellow, when Mr. Wainwright pursed his lips, before 4. Perhaps around 3:45, Miss Marple felt a quiet tightening inside her. Before 4. That was a different rhythm. Did you know him? Slack asked. No, Wainwright said. He said he was passing through. Miss Marple nodded. Passing through was another comfort people used. It meant the stranger could take blame, and the village could remain intact. Outside the shop, Slack looked troubled. A hammer. That could break a watch. It could, Miss Marple agreed. But it could also be nothing. The problem, Inspector, is that real clues often look like nothing until they are placed beside something else. Slack stared at the street, as if trying to see something hidden in plain view. All right. Who else? Mrs. Harper, Miss Marple said. They returned toward Weatherby's house. Mrs. Harper stood inside the gate again, as if unable to leave it. When she saw them, she stepped forward quickly, her face tense. Inspector, she said, I have been thinking. Perhaps I misremembered. Perhaps it was not 4:30. Perhaps it was later. Slack's eyes narrowed. Yesterday, you said 4:30. Firmly, Mrs. Harper swallowed. Well, everything is so confused. Such a shock. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. Mrs. Harper, what time did you put the kettle on? Mrs. Harper stared. The kettle? Yes, Miss Marple said. When did you light the stove? When did you hear it begin to sing? Mrs. Harper's lips trembled. I do not know. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but there was a firmness beneath it now. You do know. You know because you do it every day. Tell me, do you put the kettle on when the church bell rings the quarter hour? Mrs. Harper's eyes widened, and Miss Marple knew she had touched something true. Yes, Mrs. Harper whispered. At 1:15. I always do. Slack leaned forward. Which 1:15? 4:15. Mrs. Harper's face drained of color. Yes. And how long does it take? Miss Marple asked softly, before you carry the tray. Mrs. Harper's voice came out thin. About 10 minutes. Slack's eyes hardened. That would put you carrying it at 4:25, Mrs. Harper gripped the gate so tightly her knuckles whitened. Yes, that is what I said. Miss Marple tilted her head. But if the kettle was put on at 4:15, and you carried the tray at 4:25, that does not tell us what happened in the sitting room before you arrived. Mrs. Harper's breathing became shallow. I did not see anything before. Miss Marple stepped closer, her tone gentle. No, but you might have heard something. A sound from the sitting room, a chair moving, a heavy step, a door closing softly. Mrs. Harper's eyes filled with sudden tears. I heard a click. Slack's voice was sharp. A click? Mrs. Harper nodded, trembling, like a watch being snapped shut. Or a drawer closing. Something small, but definite. Miss Marple's gaze stayed on her face. And when did you hear it? Mrs. Harper's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then she whispered, "Before I put the kettle on." Slack's posture stiffened. "Before 4:15. Mrs. Harper nodded again, tears slipping down her cheeks now. I did not want to say it. It sounded foolish. A click. What is a click? Miss Marple's voice was soft and steady. In a quiet house, Mrs. Harper, a click can be louder than a scream. Slack stared at her, his certainty about 4:25 shifting, cracking like thin ice. Miss Marple looked down the lane toward the village green. The morning mist had gone, but the air still felt hushed. The village had gathered itself around a convenient hour, and now that hour was beginning to loosen. 4:25 was not the beginning. It was the story. And behind the story, earlier, quieter, and far more dangerous, the real hour waited. Miss Marple turned her face slightly as the church bells began to ring again. Bright and confident, she listened as she always did, not merely to the sound, but to what people did when they heard it. Some looked relieved. Some looked uneasy. And one or two, she suspected, looked as if they wished the bells would stop. Because the more the bells rang, the harder it became to pretend that time itself had not been arranged. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the person who had staged 4:25 was beginning to understand that Miss Marple was not interested in comfort. She was interested in truth. Chapter 3. A habit that did not match the day. St. Mary Mead had always treated time with a particular reverence. Not the bold sort of reverence reserved for birthdays and weddings, but the quieter kind that lived in habits. The milk arrived when it should. The post was delivered with dependable regularity. The church bells marked the hours like a steady hand on a shoulder, reminding the village that life could be counted, measured, and kept in order. That morning, however, time felt less like a comfort and more like a question. Miss Marple sat again in her front room, her knitting returned to her lap, though her needles moved only when her mind allowed them to. A cup of tea steamed beside her, untouched for long moments, as she listened to the faint ticks and creaks of her cottage. A floorboard settling, a kettle cooling, a sparrow tapping at the sill. Her own clock, a modest one, kept its rhythm without drama. It did not know that a man in the village had died beside a broken watch. It did not know that the village had gathered around a neat hour and called it truth. Miss Marple did know, and she knew too that routines were more revealing than confessions. Mr. Lionel Weatherby, she had learned from years of hearing the village speak, was a man who lived through habit. He ate at the same times, walked the same path to the green, checked the church clock with a seriousness that bordered on devotion. He repaired timepieces not only for money, but because the very act of making time behave correctly seemed to reassure him. A man like that did not allow his pocket watch to fall, crack, and stop without reason. Miss Marple finished her tea, set it down, and rose. She put on her coat and gloves with quiet deliberation. Then she went out into the village, not in search of drama, but in search of pattern. She began at the library, a small, quiet building that smelled of paper and dust, and the faintly sweet perfume of polish. The librarian, Mrs. Sayers, looked startled to see her. "Miss Marple, I did not expect you so early." "Habit," Miss Marple said with a mild smile. "I find it a useful thing." Mrs. Sayers nodded, as though that explained everything. "Everyone is quite upset, of course," Miss Marple replied. "May I ask, Mrs. Sayers, did Mr. Weatherby ever come here?" "Sometimes. He enjoyed reading about inventions and old craftsmen. He liked anything about precision. And when he came," Miss Marple asked, "was it at a particular time?" Mrs. Sayers frowned, thinking. Yes, actually. He came most Tuesdays at 10:30. But sometimes he came on a Thursday around 3:30. Always after lunch. Always before tea, never after tea, Miss Marple said softly. No, Mrs. Sayers replied. He disliked being out when the village was settling down for the afternoon. He said it made the clock sound louder in empty houses. Miss Marple thanked her and left, walking slowly toward the green. As she walked, she pictured Weatherby in his sitting room yesterday, close to tea time, likely expecting the familiar tray, the familiar warmth, the familiar assurance that the day would continue as planned. Then she pictured, instead, an interruption, a moment that did not belong, a habit that did not match the day. Inspector Slack met her near the police station, his face tired but sharper than it had been the day before. He had the air of a man who disliked being pushed by uncertainty, yet could not deny that uncertainty had pushed back. You were right, he said grudgingly. Mrs. Harper is giving us something different now. She heard a click before 4:15. That makes our neat time window less neat. Neatness is rarely a feature of crime, Miss Marple said gently. Slack glanced at her. We went back over a few statements. Some people are suddenly less sure about their times. Funny that, Miss Marple nodded. Fear makes memory either sharper or softer. It depends what the person is trying to protect. Slack gestured toward the road. Come with me. We are going to Weatherby's house again. Dr. Haydock says we should check his papers more carefully. There may be something about medication or health. Yes, Miss Marple said, and there may be something about time. The house felt colder than before. Even in daylight, it carried the stillness of a room that had been shocked into silence. The sitting room had been left largely as it was, though the body was gone now. The empty chair seemed to hold the outline of a man who had sat there only moments ago. Slack walked through to the workshop, and Miss Marple followed. On a shelf, lined neatly among tins and tools, were small notebooks. A collection, each one labeled with a year. Slack picked one up. Records. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. A man like Weatherby would record everything. Watches are unfaithful creatures, Inspector. They need reminding. Slack flipped pages. Repairs. Names. Dates. Notes about faults. Notes about unusual behavior. Notes about how a particular watch ran fast when held near the fireplace, or how another slowed in damp weather. Miss Marple leaned in closer, careful not to touch. Her eyes scanned the handwriting, precise and small. Then she saw it. A line written in a slightly darker ink than the others. Tuesday. 4 o'clock. Appointment. D. Crane. Slack saw her expression. What is it? Miss Marple pointed. There. Slack read it, then looked up sharply. Dorothy Crane. She said she was at the post office at 4:15. Yes, Miss Marple said. But Weatherby wrote this for 4 o'clock. Slack's jaw tightened. Could be a different day. Miss Marple shook her head. Look at the top. The date. Slack checked. It was yesterday's date. His face hardened. That changes things. It does, Miss Marple replied calmly. Because it means someone was expected. Someone planned to be here at 4. Slack set the notebook down with care, his movements suddenly controlled, as though he feared that any roughness might scatter the truth. An appointment at 4, he said, and the watch supposedly stopped at 4:25, and Mrs. Harper heard a click before 4:15. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. The click may have been the end of the appointment, Inspector, or the end of something far more serious. Slack looked around the workshop. Where would he meet someone? In the sitting room. Or here, Miss Marple said, her gaze moving over the bench, the drawers, the tools. A workshop offers privacy. It offers reasons to handle metal, to open a watch, to close it again. Slack frowned. Dorothy Crane is not a watchmaker. No, Miss Marple agreed. But she may have had a reason to come. A family reason. A financial reason, or a reason that begins with fear. Slack paced once, then stopped. We need to talk to her again. Yes, Miss Marple said. But first, Inspector, we must understand what Weatherby intended. She gestured toward a small desk in the corner. It held letters stacked neatly, each one tied with string. The kind of arrangement that suggested a man who feared disorder more than loneliness. Slack moved to the desk and began to examine the top pile with gloved hands. Most were bills. Some were notes from customers. One was a thin envelope with the postmark from London. The name on it was familiar, Dorothy Crane. Slack's eyes narrowed. She wrote to him. Miss Marple nodded, and if she wrote to him, she may have asked for something. Slack opened the envelope carefully and read the letter in silence. His face changed as he read. What? Miss Marple asked quietly. Slack lowered the page. She is asking about something that belonged to her mother. A watch. She says her mother told her Lionel kept it safe. She wants it back. Miss Marple's gaze held steady. A watch again. Slack swallowed, annoyed by the pattern. She says it has sentimental value. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Sentiment is often the polite name for leverage. Slack looked down at the letter again. She says she will come at 4 to collect it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So Weatherby expected her. He wrote it in his notebook, and someone heard a click before 4:15. Slack's tone sharpened. If Dorothy came at 4, she could have been here when he died. She could, Miss Marple said, but we must be careful. A person can be expected without being guilty. Slack exhaled. Still, it puts her closer. Miss Marple walked slowly around the workshop, her eyes taking in the drawers. Most were labeled. One drawer, however, was not. It sat slightly lower than the others, as though it had been used more often. Inspector, she said softly, has anyone opened that drawer? Slack followed her gaze. Not yet. He tried it. It was locked. Miss Marple tilted her head. Then, the keys become important again. Slack frowned and stepped back toward the hook by the door. The labeled keys hung there, orderly. But one space on the hook was empty. Slack's eyes narrowed. One is missing. Miss Marple's face remained composed. Yes, Slack turned sharply. Mrs. Harper. They found Mrs. Harper in the kitchen, wiping a counter that did not need wiping. Her hands looked red from scrubbing. Her eyes darted up when they entered. Slack held his voice controlled. Mrs. Harper, where is the missing key? Mrs. Harper froze. I do not know. Slack stepped closer. One key is gone from the hook. A key to a drawer in the workshop. Where is it? Mrs. Harper's breathing tightened. I have not taken it. Miss Marple spoke gently. Mrs. Harper, you told us you heard a click. Did you go into the workshop yesterday before making the tea? Mrs. Harper's eyes filled again. No. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. Then someone else did. Mrs. Harper's lips trembled. I did not see anyone. Miss Marple nodded. You may not have. But someone was here. Someone expected. Someone with a reason to handle watches. Someone who needed a particular thing, locked away. Slack's face was grim now. If that key is missing, someone took something. Or hid something. Miss Marple's eyes softened. But her words were firm. And Mr. Weatherby may have died because he would not give it willingly. Slack stared at her. The certainty of 4:25 was now in pieces. An appointment at 4. A missing key. A locked drawer. A letter asking for a watch. A click heard before 4:15. Time was no longer a simple line. It was a knot. And Miss Marple, with the calm patience of someone unafraid of long, careful work, had begun to loosen it. Dorothy Crane received them in the front parlor of her cottage with the kind of composure that looked rehearsed. Even if it was not. She was a young woman with neat hands and a controlled smile. The room around her was tidy in the way a person makes things tidy when they fear being judged. Fresh flowers sat in a vase that had been turned so the prettiest side faced the door. A tray with teacups waited, though no one had asked for tea yet. Inspector Slack remained standing. Miss Marple sat quietly, her posture relaxed, her expression mild. Dorothy poured tea anyway, perhaps because pouring tea gave her hands something to do. "Miss Crane," Slack said, "you told us yesterday you were at the post office at 4:15. "Yes," Dorothy replied smoothly. "I posted a letter." Slack's eyes stayed on her. "Mr. Weatherby recorded an appointment with you at 4 o'clock yesterday." Dorothy's hand faltered slightly as she set down the pot. The lid rattled. A small, sharp sound in the calm room. "I did intend to see him," she said carefully, "but I did not. I changed my mind." Slack's tone was firm. "Why?" Dorothy's smile tightened. "It was foolish. I did not wish to bother him." Miss Marple's voice drifted in, gentle as a curtain moving in a quiet breeze. "But you wrote to him. You said you would come. People do not usually write letters promising a visit and then decide it is foolish." Dorothy looked toward Miss Marple, and for a moment her composure seemed to slip. Then she gathered it again. "My mother's watch," she said. "It is a painful subject." Slack leaned forward slightly. "Then tell us about it." Dorothy lifted her chin. "My mother told me that Mr. Weatherby kept it safe. She said it was valuable. Not in money, but in memory. And you wanted it back," Slack said. "Yes," Dorothy replied. "I did?" Miss Marple's gaze remained soft. "Did you go to the house?" Dorothy hesitated, then nodded. "I went to the gate." Slack's eyes narrowed. "That is not the same as being in the post office." Dorothy swallowed. "I went to the gate at about 10 minutes to 4. I stood there. I could not bring myself to knock. It felt wrong. Then I walked away." Slack's voice sharpened. "And then you went to the post office?" "Yes," Dorothy said quickly. "I thought it would look suspicious if I did not do something normal." Slack paused at that. It was an honest slip, and honest slips were valuable. Miss Marple's voice was mild. "Why would it look suspicious?" Dorothy's cheeks colored. "Because everyone knows I wrote to him. Because I was upset. I did not want people to say I had been there." Slack stared. "So you were thinking of what people would say?" Dorothy's hands tightened around her teacup. "This is a village. People talk." Miss Marple nodded, almost sympathetically. "Yes, people talk. That is why it is difficult to tell the truth when the truth is inconvenient." Slack took a breath. "Miss Crane, there is a missing key from Mr. Weatherby's workshop. A drawer is locked. We found an appointment note with your name. We found your letter. We have a witness who heard a click in the house before 4:15. Dorothy's eyes widened. "A click?" Miss Marple's tone stayed gentle. "A sound like a watch being shut. Or a drawer closing." Dorothy's lips parted slightly, and Miss Marple saw the briefest flicker of fear. "You did go inside," Slack said, quietly but firmly. Dorothy shook her head quickly. "No. No, I did not." Slack's gaze did not move. "Then who did?" Dorothy's eyes lowered. Her voice came out thin. "I do not know." Miss Marple watched her closely. Dorothy was not a calm liar. She was a frightened one. And frightened people often hid behind half-truths, believing half-truths were safer than full ones. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Dorothy, you said your mother told you Mr. Weatherby kept the watch safe. Did your mother say why?" Dorothy's throat worked. "She said she had made a mistake once. She said she trusted the wrong person. She said Lionel had promised to keep it until the right time." "The right time," Miss Marple repeated softly. Dorothy looked up at her, eyes shining now. "I thought the right time was when she died. But perhaps she meant something else. Perhaps she meant when I was older. When I would understand." Slack's expression tightened. "Understand what?" Dorothy's voice shook. "I do not know." Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but carried weight. "Was your mother connected to anyone else in the village?" Someone who would fear what was inside that watch. Dorothy's eyes darted toward the window. No. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That was too quick, my dear. Dorothy's breathing became shallow. I do not want trouble. Slack's tone was hard. Trouble has already arrived. Mr. Weatherby is dead. Dorothy flinched at the words. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she pressed her fingers to her mouth as if to stop them. Miss Marple waited. Silence was often kinder than pressing too quickly. Finally, Dorothy spoke, voice trembling. My mother worked for Mr. Weatherby years ago. She cleaned for him when I was a child. She also worked for Mr. Wainwright sometimes. She said she saw things she should not have seen. Slack's eyes narrowed. What things? Dorothy shook her head. She never told me. She only said, if anyone asked about the watch, never give it away. Not until you know why they want it. Miss Marple felt a quiet chill. Not because the story was dramatic, but because it was familiar. The dead often left warnings in ordinary words, hoping the living would understand them in time. Slack's voice sharpened. Miss Crane, did you ever see the watch? Dorothy nodded. Once. When I was 16. Lionel showed it to me. He said it was not really a watch. Not anymore. He said it was a container. A container, Slack repeated. Dorothy wiped her face. He said there was something inside. Something hidden. He said one day it might save me. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but inside her thoughts moved with steady clarity. A watch that was not a watch. A missing key. A locked drawer. A murder staged around a time. A man who noticed things, who recorded things, who kept objects safe. Slack stood very still now, absorbing it. If it was a container, it could hold anything. A note. A photograph. Something incriminating. Dorothy nodded. Weakly. Yes. Miss Marple spoke gently. Dorothy, you went to his gate yesterday. You were close enough to be the expected visitor at 4, but you did not knock. Why did you not knock? Dorothy's voice was small. Because I saw someone inside. Through the side window. Someone in the workshop. Slack's eyes narrowed. Someone you recognized. Dorothy's lips trembled. Yes, Miss Marple's voice stayed soft. Who? Dorothy swallowed hard. Mr. Wainwright. Slack's posture stiffened. The hardware shop owner. Dorothy nodded, tears returning. He was in the workshop. He had his coat on. He was leaning over the bench. And I heard something. A small snap. Like metal being shut. Miss Marple's eyes softened. The click. Dorothy nodded again. Yes, Slack's voice was controlled, but the anger beneath it was clear. Why did you not tell us? Dorothy looked down. Because he saw me. He looked up. He looked straight at me through the glass. And he smiled. Not kindly. Not politely. He smiled as if he knew what I was thinking. And he wanted me to remember that he knew. Miss Marple felt the truth settle into place like a piece of a puzzle, finally fitting. Not certainty yet, but direction. A threat. A warning. Ought-like control. Slack took a slow breath. And then, Dorothy's voice shook. Then I walked away. I went to the post office. I posted a letter I did not need to post. I wanted people to see me there. I wanted to anchor myself somewhere else. Slack stared at her. That is why your story sounded rehearsed. Dorothy nodded miserably. Yes. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but carried a quiet firmness. Dorothy, you may have been frightened, but your fear has cost time. And time, in cases like this, is precious. Slack turned toward the door, his jaw set. We are going to Wainwright. Miss Marple rose slowly. Yes. But carefully. Inspector. Slack paused, glancing at her. Carefully, Miss Marple nodded. A man who can stage a watch and smile through a window is a man who believes he is ahead. Do not give him a chance to move the pieces again. They left Dorothy's cottage and stepped into the cold afternoon. The village looked ordinary. A child ran across the green. A woman carried shopping. A dog barked at nothing in particular. Ordinary scenes, Miss Marple knew, were often the finest disguises. As they walked, the church bells rang the quarter hour, bright, confident. The village lifted its head to the sound as if reassured. But Miss Marple heard something else beneath it. A click, the memory of it, the implication of it. A small sound that had opened a door into the truth, and the truth, once opened, did not easily close again. Chapter 4. The Lie Hidden Inside the Alibi. The hardware shop sat on the corner of the high street, like a place that had learned how to appear harmless. Its windows were clean. Its shelves were orderly. Every nail and hinge had its place. People trusted shops like that. They trusted the men who ran them. Trust, Miss Marple knew, was often built from repetition rather than truth. Mr. Wainwright stood behind the counter when Inspector Slack and Miss Marple entered. He looked up with a smile that was practiced enough to be convincing, though not warm enough to be sincere. "Inspector," he said briskly. "Back again. I hope I can be of help." Inspector Slack did not return the smile. He removed his hat slowly and placed it on the counter, as though grounding himself. "You can," Slack said. By answering a few questions, Mr. Wainwright's gaze flicked briefly to Miss Marple, then back to the inspector. Of course, Miss Marple stood slightly apart, her hands folded, her expression mild. She did not look like an accuser. She looked like a listener. "Yesterday afternoon," Slack said, "you said you were in the shop the entire time between 4 and 5. "That's right," Wainwright replied smoothly. "Customers came in and out. I did not leave." "Do you remember who came in around 4? Slack asked. Wainwright shrugged. It was an ordinary day. People buy nails, screws, picture hooks. "I do not keep a ledger of faces." Miss Marple's voice drifted in quietly. "But you remembered the young man who bought a small hammer." Wainwright's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Yes, because he was not from the village, and because he was in a hurry," Miss Marple added. Wainwright hesitated. "Yes," Inspector Slack leaned forward. "When did he come in?" "Before 4, Wainwright said. "Around 3:45. And after he left," Slack continued, "did anyone else come in before 4:15? Wainwright frowned, as though searching his memory. "I do not believe so." Miss Marple watched him carefully. The searching was too slow, too deliberate. People remembered gaps more clearly than they remembered crowds. "Mr. Wainwright," she said gently, "how long does it take you to close the shop if you need to step out briefly?" Wainwright stiffened. "Why would I need to step out?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "To fetch something from the back. To speak to someone. To take a breath." "I did not step out," Wainwright said firmly. Inspector Slack's tone sharpened. "Mr. Wainwright, we have reason to believe you were seen at Mr. Weatherby's house shortly before 4. Wainwright's face drained of a little color. He recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. "That is nonsense," he said. "I had no reason to be there." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "You sold watches and clock parts, did you not?" "Occasionally," Wainwright replied. "But Weatherby did his own work, yes," Miss Marple said. "And he noticed when things were not as they should be." The words landed softly, but they landed. Wainwright's jaw tightened. "You are suggesting I killed him?" "No," Miss Marple said calmly. "I am suggesting that your alibi is very tidy. And tidy alibis often hide something inside them." Inspector Slack moved from behind the counter toward the shelves. "Yesterday, you told us you were with customers. Today, you cannot name any. You remember the young man, because he stands out. But you remember no one else. That is convenient." Wainwright bristled. "Are you accusing me of lying?" "I am accusing you," Slack said, "of being selective." Miss Marple stepped closer to the counter, her gaze drifting to the small hammers hanging neatly in a row. "Mr. Wainwright," she said softly, Do you sell many of these? Picture hammers, he replied. Yes. And yesterday, Miss Marple continued, you sold one to a stranger, yes. But you did not sell one to yourself, Miss Marple said. Wainwright stared at her. What? Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. I mean that you had access to these tools already. You would not need to purchase one. You would simply take it. Inspector Slack's eyes sharpened. Are you suggesting he used a hammer to break the watch? I am suggesting, Miss Marple replied, that a hammer would explain the clean fracture. Not a drop, not an accident. A controlled strike. Wainwright's hands clenched at his sides. This is ridiculous. Inspector Slack's voice was steady. Then you will not mind if we search the shop. Wainwright's smile did not return. I do mind. That is unfortunate, Slack said, because we are going to do it anyway. The search was careful and methodical. Shelves were checked. Drawers opened. The back room examined. Miss Marple moved quietly, noticing small things. A smudge on the workbench. A cloth that had been folded too hastily. A faint metallic scent that did not belong to paint or polish. She stopped near a bin under the counter. Inspector, she said softly. Slack came over. Inside the bin lay scraps of paper, dust, and beneath them, a small metal fragment. Slack lifted it with gloved fingers. What is it? Miss Marple leaned closer. A piece of casing. From a pocket watch. Slack's jaw tightened. You said you did not leave the shop. Wainwright's voice was sharp now. I repair watches sometimes. That proves nothing. Miss Marple nodded. No, it proves something else. She gestured toward the fragment. This piece was broken recently. The edges are fresh, and yet Mr. Weatherby repaired his watches himself. Slack's gaze stayed on Wainwright. Why is a fragment of his watch in your bin? Wainwright's breathing quickened. I do not know. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. You do know. You know because you were there. You went to his workshop. You handled the watch. You broke it deliberately. Wainwright laughed sharply, but it did not sound convincing. And why would I do that? Miss Marple met his eyes. Because the watch was not just a watch. Silence followed. Heavy and uncomfortable. Inspector Slack leaned in. What was inside it? Wainwright's eyes flicked away. Miss Marple continued gently. A photograph. A note. Something that tied you to something you wanted buried. Wainwright's voice was strained. You are guessing. Yes, Miss Marple said. But guessing guided by habit. People hide what they fear being found. And you feared Mr. Weatherby because he noticed things. Inspector Slack straightened. We will take you in for questioning. Wainwright's face hardened. You have nothing that proves I killed him. Miss Marple spoke softly, but with certainty. No, not yet. But you have already told us something important. Wainwright sneered. What? That you cared enough about the watch to break it, Miss Marple replied. That tells us it mattered. As they led Wainwright out of the shop, the village seemed to watch without appearing to. Curtains shifted. A door opened and closed. Whispers began again, cautious but eager. Miss Marple walked beside Inspector Slack, her pace unhurried. You believe he is the murderer, Slack said quietly. I believe, Miss Marple replied, that he is the man who tried to control the story. Slack frowned. That is not the same thing, no, Miss Marple said. But it is often close. They reached the police station, and Wainwright was taken inside. Miss Marple paused on the pavement, listening to the village sounds settle again. Inspector, she said, we must be careful now. Slack glanced at her. Careful of what? Of thinking that the broken watch is the whole truth, Miss Marple said. It is only the door. Slack exhaled. You think there is more? Yes, Miss Marple said calmly. There always is. The interview room was small, plain, and deliberately unwelcoming. Mr. Wainwright sat at the table, his posture stiff, his expression defensive. Inspector Slack remained standing, hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. Miss Marple sat quietly to one side, her presence almost domestic, as though she had wandered in by mistake. But Wainwright watched her carefully. "Let us start again," Slack said. "Yesterday afternoon. Where were you at 3:45? "In my shop," Wainwright replied. "And at 4 o'clock?" Slack continued. "In my shop, and at 4:10, Slack said. "In my shop," Wainwright snapped. Miss Marple's voice was mild. "Mr. Wainwright, you are repeating yourself. That often happens when people are reciting rather than remembering." Wainwright glared at her. "I remember very well." "Then tell us," Miss Marple said gently, "what you noticed." Wainwright hesitated. What sounds did you hear?" Miss Marple asked. "What did you smell? Was there a draft when the door opened?" Wainwright swallowed. "I do not recall." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "But you recall selling a hammer?" "Yes." "And you recall that the young man was not from the village?" Slack said. "Yes, and yet you recall nothing else," Slack pressed. "Not one face, not one sound, not one interruption." Wainwright's jaw tightened. "It was an ordinary day," Miss Marple nodded. "Extraordinarily ordinary." She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Wainwright, you went to Mr. Weatherby's house yesterday." "I did not," Wainwright said. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Then how did you know which drawer held the watch?" Wainwright froze. Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. "Which drawer?" Miss Marple continued softly. "The unlabeled one. The one that required a specific key. The one that is now locked and missing that key." Wainwright's breathing became audible. "I never said anything about a drawer." "No," Miss Marple said. "But you acted as though you knew it existed. That knowledge did not come from nowhere." Slack leaned in. "Did you work for Weatherby?" Wainwright hesitated. "Years ago. Occasionally." "And did you ever see the watch then?" Slack asked. Wainwright's voice was flat. "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Did you recognize what it contained?" Wainwright closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Silence settled again. Heavy. Expectant. "What was inside?" Slack asked. Wainwright opened his eyes slowly. "A photograph," Miss Marple nodded. "Of whom?" Wainwright swallowed. "Of me. And Dorothy Crane's mother." Slack stiffened. "In what context?" Wainwright's voice dropped. "In a place we should not have been. In a time when I was already married." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "And the photograph proved it." "Yes," Wainwright said. "She kept it as insurance. Lionel kept it safe." Slack's voice hardened. "So you killed him to get it?" "No," Wainwright said quickly. "I went to get the watch. I did not plan to kill him." Miss Marple watched him closely. "Then what happened?" Wainwright's shoulders sagged slightly. "He would not give it to me. He said it was not time." "The right time," Miss Marple murmured. Wainwright nodded. "He said Dorothy deserved the truth. That I had already taken too much." Slack's jaw clenched. And then, Wainwright said quietly, "I tried to take it." He struggled. Not much. He was older. He fell. He struck his head. Miss Marple's voice was steady. "And you panicked?" "Yes," Wainwright whispered. "You broke the watch," Miss Marple said, "to hide the contents." "Yes." "And you set the time," Miss Marple continued, "to make the village settle around a neat story." Wainwright nodded again. "Defeated. I knew they would. They always do." Inspector Slack exhaled slowly. "Why 4:25? Wainwright laughed bitterly. "Because it was after the appointment. After anyone would expect trouble. It felt safe." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "But you did not count on habit." Wainwright looked at her. "Habit. Yes," Miss Marple said. "The kettle. The bells. The click. The small things people notice when they are not trying to hide." Wainwright lowered his head. "I did not mean to kill him." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Few people ever do. They mean to protect themselves." Slack straightened. "We will need to recover the contents of the watch." Wainwright looked up sharply. "I hid it." "Where?" Slack demanded. Wainwright hesitated, then sighed. In the clock tower. Inside the casing. I thought no one would look there. Everyone trusts the bells. Miss Marple felt a quiet sadness. Trust misplaced always carried a cost. Later, as they walked away from the station, the bells rang again, steady and reassuring. They trusted the wrong thing, Slack muttered. Miss Marple smiled faintly. No. They trusted the right thing for the wrong reason. Slack glanced at her. And what is that? Time, Miss Marple replied softly. Time always tells the truth, eventually. It simply asks us to listen carefully. Chapter 5. When the watch finally tells the truth. The climb to the church tower was slower than Inspector Slack expected, and slower still than the village liked to admit. The steps were narrow and worn, polished smooth by centuries of careful feet. Each one creaked softly underfoot, as though the tower itself wished to announce every movement made within it. Miss Marple climbed without complaint. She held the rail lightly, her breath steady, her expression thoughtful rather than strained. This was not her first ascent of the tower. She had climbed it once before, years ago, when a bat had found its way into the bell chamber and refused to leave. She remembered thinking then how strange it was that something so high and visible could still hide what no one wished to see. Inspector Slack paused halfway up, glancing back at her. "Are you quite all right?" "Quite," Miss Marple replied. "Truth is never as heavy as it appears. It only feels that way when people have been sitting on it." They reached the bell chamber, where the great bronze bells hung in dignified silence. Dust floated in the air, catching the light that filtered through the narrow openings. The smell was unmistakable. Old metal. Old wood. Old time. Slack moved toward the main casing, his movements careful now, almost reverent. He reached inside, feeling along the inner ledge, then stopped. "I have something," he said. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes sharp despite the dimness. Slack withdrew a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay the contents of the watch. A folded photograph. A thin strip of paper, yellowed with age. Slack exhaled slowly. So this is what he killed for. Miss Marple looked at the photograph, without touching it. It showed a younger Mr. Wainwright standing too close to a woman whose resemblance to Dorothy Crane was unmistakable. Their expressions were not scandalous in themselves, but they spoke of something intimate, something secret, something that had no place in the open daylight of the village. Slack unfolded the paper. It was a note, written in Mr. Weatherby's precise hand. "If anything happens to me, this belongs to Dorothy Crane." Truth should not remain hidden, simply because it is uncomfortable. Slack closed his eyes briefly. He knew. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "He always knew." They descended the tower in silence. The bells above them remained still. But Miss Marple felt as though they were ringing nonetheless, sounding a truth that could not be unheard. Back at the station, Dorothy Crane sat quietly in a small room, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when they entered, her eyes tired, but clear. Inspector Slack placed the photograph and the note on the table. Dorothy stared at them for a long moment, then reached for the note. Her fingers trembled as she read it. "He kept it," she whispered. "He kept it safe." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "He did exactly what he promised your mother." Dorothy picked up the photograph. Her breath caught, but she did not cry. Instead, she looked at it with a strange steadiness, as though something that had been pressing on her for years had finally shifted. "So it was true," she said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. Truth has a way of waiting patiently. Dorothy lowered the photograph. "He killed him because of this." "He killed him," Miss Marple said softly, "because he feared what this represented. Exposure. Accountability. Consequence." Dorothy closed her eyes briefly. "I wondered why my mother always told me never to trust certainty." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She was wiser than she knew. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. Mr. Wainwright has given a full statement. He admits to the struggle. He admits to breaking the watch and staging the time. Dorothy nodded slowly. And Lionel Weatherby, he will be remembered, Miss Marple said, as a man who respected time, and more importantly, respected truth. Dorothy looked at her, tears finally forming. He saved me from living a lie. Miss Marple reached across the table and laid her hand gently over Dorothy's. He believed you deserved better than silence. Outside, the afternoon light shifted. The village continued its routines, unaware that something fundamental had been set right, but it would feel it soon enough. The village gathered 2 days later, as it always did, when something needed to be acknowledged without being discussed too openly. People stood in small clusters near the green, voices low, expressions careful. The news had spread, of course. News always did, but it had softened in the telling, wrapped in euphemism and relief. Mr. Wainwright had been taken away quietly. No shouting, no spectacle, just the steady removal of a man who had been part of the village for so long that his absence felt unnatural. Miss Marple stood near the edge of the green, watching as the familiar rhythms resumed. A child skipped stones. A woman adjusted her shopping bag. The postman tipped his hat. Inspector Slack joined her. They will talk about this for years. Yes, Miss Marple replied. But not about the important part. Slack frowned. Which is that a man was killed because he believed truth could be managed like a clock, Miss Marple said. Wound when convenient. Stopped when inconvenient. Slack sighed. And you? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I will be forgotten again, which is quite all right. They walked together toward the church. Inside, the bells began to ring, full and clear, marking the hour without apology. Miss Marple paused, listening. They sound different, Slack said. They sound the same, Miss Marple corrected gently. We hear them differently now. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She set her knitting aside and wound her own small clock carefully, feeling the familiar resistance of the mechanism. It ticked on, steady and unconcerned. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. Outside, Mrs. Bantry passed again, waving as she had before, as though nothing had changed. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. The broken watch had told the truth at last, not by stopping time, but by revealing what time could not hide. A lie could live for years if protected by habit and silence. But truth, once released, moved with a quiet inevitability. She thought of Lionel Weatherby, bent over his workbench, listening to the delicate rhythm of gears and springs, a man who understood that even the smallest mechanism could carry great responsibility. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Human nature, she reflected, was much the same. People wound themselves tightly around secrets, believing control would keep them safe. But pressure always built. And eventually, something cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for someone who was paying attention to hear the click. Outside, the light softened as evening approached. The village settled into its familiar calm, reassured by bells, by tea, by the illusion that everything was once again in order. Miss Marple knew better. Order was not the absence of truth. It was the willingness to face it. She picked up her knitting again, the needles clicking softly, steadily, keeping time in their own quiet way. And somewhere in the village, a watch no longer needed to lie. The village returned to its quiet rhythms with remarkable speed. Doors were opened again without hesitation. Teacups were set out at familiar hours. Conversations drifted back to gardens, weather, and small domestic concerns, as though nothing permanent had been disturbed. That was the gift St. Mary Mead gave itself. The ability to continue. Miss Marple understood this instinct well. People needed routine the way clocks needed winding. Without it, the days felt unmoored. From her window, she watched the late afternoon settle gently over the lane. Shadows lengthened. A bird called once, and then fell silent. Somewhere, a clock chimed the hour with calm certainty. Lionel Weatherby's name would fade into polite remembrance. Mr. Wainwright would become a cautionary phrase spoken softly and only when necessary. Dorothy Crane would carry the truth forward, no longer wrapped in silence, but no longer weighted by it either. Miss Marple lifted her teacup and smiled faintly. Time, she reflected, never truly belonged to anyone. It could be measured, trusted, even respected, but never controlled. Those who tried learned eventually that truth moved at its own pace, patient and persistent. She set her cup down and returned to her knitting, the gentle click of the needles marking moments as faithfully as any watch. Outside, the village breathed on, and somewhere within that quiet continuity, the truth remained, no longer hidden, no longer hurried, simply allowed to exist.